The map on our dashboard had waited 14 years, but neither of us realized the destination was never the place we were driving toward. The folded highway map rested between us exactly where it had been all those years ago, its edges worn from being opened and closed far more times than it had ever been used. Mason Brooks smiled as he smoothed it across the dashboard of his aging blue SUV before starting the engine. "You still kept it," I said, unable to hide my surprise. He laughed softly without taking his eyes off the windshield. "You made me promise I would." That sounded like something 12-year-old Ethan Walker would have done. Back then we had spent nearly every summer afternoon riding our bicycles through our small hometown, pointing at distant highways and convincing ourselves that one day we would drive across the country together. We circled places on an old paper map with bright red marker, giving each destination a number as though we were planning the greatest adventure two kids had ever imagined. Life, however, had its own schedule. College arrived. Careers pulled us in different directions. I became a freelance photographer, chasing stories through my camera lens whenever work appeared. Mason became a mechanical engineer, building a steady career while somehow remaining the one person who never forgot to call on my birthday. Years passed before either of us noticed how quickly childhood had become memory. Then, one ordinary Saturday afternoon a month earlier, Mason appeared at my apartment carrying that same faded map. "You still owe me a road trip," he had said with a grin. I could not think of a single reason to refuse. Now the city slowly disappeared behind us as the interstate stretched toward the horizon beneath a bright summer sky. Music drifted quietly from the speakers while miles of green fields rolled past the windows. Everything felt strangely familiar, almost as though we had stepped back into a promise we had paused instead of forgotten. We talked about almost everything except the future. Mason teased me about the camera bag taking up half the back seat. I reminded him that he still packed snacks as though we were leaving. Civilization forever. Somewhere between the laughter and the comfortable silence, I realized nothing about our friendship had ever felt forced. It had simply continued through every season of our lives, no matter how much the world around us changed. Around lunchtime, we stopped at a small roadside diner tucked beside an old gas station. The waitress greeted us with warm smiles and poured coffee before we even opened the menus. Mason ordered my favorite breakfast without asking. I looked at him, amused. "You remember?" He looked genuinely confused. "You have ordered the same thing since 8th grade." I laughed. That is probably true. Small moments like that had always surrounded us. Mason remembered which songs I skipped whenever they played on the radio. He remembered I hated driving through heavy traffic. He even remembered the exact brand of camera strap I preferred after I mentioned it once years earlier. I had always considered those details part of being lifelong friends. I never questioned them. After lunch, we returned to the highway, following winding roads through forests and quiet mountain towns. Late in the afternoon, a gentle rain began tapping against the windshield. Mason lowered the speed slightly, while the landscape softened beneath gray clouds. I watched the raindrops race across the glass before noticing something unusual. Every time I looked away from the road, I caught Mason glancing toward me for just a second before focusing forward again. It happened once, then twice, then several more times over the next hour. When I finally smiled and asked, "What?" he hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he smiled back in that familiar, easy way I had known since childhood. "Nothing," he answered quietly. "I was just thinking about how long I have been looking forward to this trip." I believed him, yet something in his voice suggested there was another sentence he had almost spoken before choosing to keep it to himself. And without realizing it, I began wondering whether this journey meant something more to him than simply keeping an old promise. The rain stayed with us for the rest of the afternoon, turning the highway into a ribbon of silver that stretched between endless forests and quiet mountain towns. Mason drove with the same calm confidence he had shown ever since we earned our driver's licenses, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while an old playlist filled the car with songs we both knew by heart. Every few miles, one of us would recognize a familiar tune and immediately remember where we had first heard it. Some memories made us laugh until neither of us could finish the story. Others left us smiling quietly as the landscape rolled by outside the windows. It amazed me how easily we slipped back into the rhythm we had shared as children. There were no awkward pauses, no pressure to keep the conversation alive. Silence had never been uncomfortable between us. It simply meant we trusted each other enough to enjoy the road without filling every moment with words. As the rain grew heavier, Mason suggested stopping in a small town tucked between the mountains. The main street looked as though it had barely changed in decades. A family-owned bookstore stood beside a bakery, and colorful flower boxes decorated nearly every storefront despite the weather. We wandered slowly beneath one shared umbrella, laughing every time the wind pushed rain toward us anyway. Inside the bookstore, Mason walked directly to the travel section without hesitation. "You still do that?" I said. He looked over his shoulder. "Do what?" "You always look at maps first." He smiled. "Old habits survive longer than people expect." While he browsed the shelves, I wandered toward a display of local photography books. A black and white image of a coastal highway immediately caught my attention. Before I reached for it, Mason picked it up first and handed it to me without a word. "I knew you would stop here," he said. "How?" I asked. He shrugged with a gentle smile. "You always notice photographs before anything else." It was another tiny detail he somehow remembered. That realization stayed with me even after we left the bookstore carrying nothing more than hot coffee and a postcard of the town. Back in the car, the rain finally eased into a light drizzle. We continued west until the sky slowly darkened beneath thick gray clouds. Around sunset, Mason pulled into a quiet roadside motel with a glowing vacancy sign. "Looks like this is home for tonight," he said. The owner greeted us warmly and apologized that only one room remained available because several travelers had already stopped due to the weather. Without hesitation, Mason accepted the room. We shared tents during summer camp. He joked as we carried our bags inside. "I think we will survive one motel room." I laughed because he was right. We had spent half our childhood sleeping under the same canvas roof during camping trips, telling stories long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The room itself was simple but comfortable, with 2 beds, a small wooden table, and a window overlooking rain-soaked pine trees. While I unpacked my camera equipment, Mason carried a small storage box from the back of the SUV into the room. I had never seen it before. It looked old, with faded corners and scratches that suggested it had traveled many miles. "Need help?" I asked. His expression changed almost imperceptibly before he smiled. "I have it." He set the box carefully beside his suitcase instead of opening it. Later, while searching for a flashlight after the lights flickered briefly, I accidentally noticed the lid had shifted just enough to reveal old photographs, a worn baseball ticket, a colorful friendship bracelet, and the corner of a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Mason's unmistakable handwriting. Before I could ask about it, he quietly closed the lid, meeting my eyes with a smile that carried both warmth and a secret he still was not ready to share. Morning arrived wrapped in a soft layer of mist that drifted between the pine trees outside the motel window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to every branch as sunlight slowly broke through the clouds. Mason was already awake when I opened my eyes. He stood outside beside the SUV with 2 cups of coffee balanced carefully on the hood, staring toward the mountains as though he had been waiting for the day to begin. "You still wake up too early," I said as I stepped outside. He smiled without looking away. From the horizon, "Some habits are impossible to change." He handed me one of the cups before loading our bags into the back of the vehicle. My eyes drifted briefly toward the old storage box resting beneath a folded blanket. The lid was securely closed now, hiding the photographs and the sealed envelope I had accidentally seen the night before. I almost asked him about it, but something held me back. Whatever was inside clearly mattered to him, and I did not want curiosity to become disrespect. Instead, we climbed into the SUV and continued west as the highway wound through dense forests and rolling hills. The morning air felt fresh after the storm, and every overlook seemed more beautiful than the last. Around midday, we stopped at a quiet scenic turnout overlooking a broad river that curved through the valley below. I stepped out with my camera while Mason leaned against the guardrail, watching me adjust the lens. "You always disappear behind that camera," he teased. I laughed. "Someone has to remember this trip properly." He shook his head with a gentle smile. "You already do. The camera just gives you proof." His answer stayed with me longer than I expected. I lifted the camera and took several photographs of the landscape before turning it toward him. Mason instinctively looked away. "Come on," I said. "You know I hate having my picture taken." "That has never stopped me before." He sighed dramatically before finally facing the camera. The expression he wore was relaxed, genuine, and completely unguarded. When I lowered the camera, I realized it was probably my favorite photograph I had ever taken of him. We continued driving until the road narrowed into a two-lane highway climbing toward higher elevations. Music played quietly through the speakers while long stretches of comfortable silence settled between us. It never felt awkward. In fact, I had always believed silence was one of the strongest parts of our friendship. We never needed constant conversation to remind each other that we belonged in the same space. Later that afternoon, we stopped beside a small lake surrounded by tall evergreens to prepare an early campsite. The water reflected the bright blue sky so perfectly that it almost looked unreal. While I gathered firewood nearby, Mason unpacked the camping gear with practiced efficiency. By sunset, a small campfire crackled gently between us, sending sparks into the cool evening air. There was no phone signal, no passing traffic, and no city noise, only the quiet rhythm of the lake and the warmth of the fire. We spoke about simple things at first, favorite memories from school, old teachers, and the camping trips our families used to take together every summer. Then the conversation slowed, becoming quieter and more thoughtful. Mason stared into the flames for several moments before speaking again. "Do you ever think about how strange growing up feels?" he asked softly. "When we were kids, I thought promises lasted forever because we made them. Then life got busy, and suddenly years disappeared." I nodded. I thought this trip might never happen. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand. There were moments when I thought the same thing. That is why I refused to give up on it. His voice carried a weight that reached beyond the road trip itself. I could not explain why, but sitting across the fire from him, I began to feel that the journey we had started together was leading us towards something neither of us had planned when we first unfolded that old paper map. The fire burned lower as the evening settled quietly around the lake, filling the air with the comforting scent of pine and cedar. Tiny stars gradually appeared above us one by one until the entire sky seemed brighter than I remembered from childhood. Without city lights to compete against them, the constellations stretched endlessly across the darkness. Mason leaned back against a weathered log, watching the flames dance while occasionally adding another piece of firewood. Neither of us felt any need to rush the conversation. Somehow the silence between us carried its own meaning. I broke it first. "Do you remember the last time we went camping together?" Mason smiled immediately. "You were convinced you could navigate with that tiny compass your grandfather gave you." I laughed. "We walked in the wrong direction for almost an hour, only because you refused to admit the compass was upside down." We both laughed until the sound echoed softly across the still water. It amazed me how easily we could return to those memories, as though the years between then and now had quietly disappeared. After another peaceful pause, I looked across the lake where the moon reflected like polished silver on the calm surface. "Do you ever miss being kids?" I asked. Mason thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes, mostly because life seemed simpler. Back then, I believed telling the truth was easy." I turned toward him with curiosity. "What changed?" He watched the fire instead of looking at me. "Sometimes growing older teaches you that the truth can also be the thing you are most afraid to lose." His answer lingered in the quiet night. I wanted to ask what truth he meant, but something in his expression suggested he was standing very close to a conversation he had not yet decided to have. Instead, I spoke about my own life. I admitted how uncertain freelance photography often felt, how difficult it had been watching friends build predictable careers while I chased assignments from one state to another. "Some days I wonder if I should have chosen something safer," I confessed. Mason shook his head almost immediately. "Do you remember when we were 14 and your photograph won the county fair?" I smiled faintly. "That was a long time ago." "It does not matter," he replied. "You stood there looking at your picture the same way you still look through your camera today. You have never taken photographs because they were easy. You take them because they let people see something they would have missed otherwise." I stared at him, surprised once again by how clearly he remembered moments I had nearly forgotten myself. "You always notice things about me that I do not," I admitted quietly. A gentle smile crossed his face. "Maybe because I have been paying attention for a very long time." Before I could answer, he stood and walked toward the SUV, saying he wanted to grab another bottle of water. Left alone beside the fire, I watched sparks drift upward until curiosity slowly overcame restraint. The storage box rested near the back seat, exactly where he had left it. I did not intend to invade his privacy, yet the lid had shifted slightly during the drive, revealing the familiar corner of the envelope once again. My name was written neatly across the front in handwriting that looked several years old. I never opened it. I never even touched it. I simply looked at the envelope from where I stood before quietly stepping back as Mason returned carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed one to me with his usual easy smile, completely unaware of where my thoughts had wandered. As we sat together beneath the stars once more, I realized the sealed letter was no longer simply an unanswered question. It had become the quiet center of our journey, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I felt certain that whatever words waited inside had been changing the course of this road trip long before either of us ever turned the key in the ignition. The sunrise painted the surface of the lake with soft shades of gold and pale blue, making the quiet campsite feel almost untouched by time. For a few peaceful minutes, neither Mason nor I spoke. We simply packed our gear together with the quiet efficiency that only came from years of knowing each other's habits. I folded the tent while he secured the sleeping bags. I organized the cooking supplies while he checked the tires before we returned to the highway. Every movement seemed effortless, as though we had rehearsed this routine long before the trip had ever begun. As we pulled back onto the winding mountain road, the crisp morning air drifted through the slightly open windows. Birds circled above the evergreen trees, and distant peaks slowly emerged from the fading mist. I reached for my camera whenever another breathtaking overlook appeared, while Mason patiently slowed the vehicle whenever he noticed me searching for the perfect angle. "You know," I said after taking another photograph, "most people would complain about stopping this often." Mason smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "Most people are not traveling with you." His answer made me laugh, but it also reminded me once again how naturally he adapted every part of the journey to make it enjoyable for me. Around midday, we stopped beside an old scenic picnic area overlooking a wide valley filled with wildflowers. Mason volunteered to prepare lunch while I wandered a short distance with my camera, capturing the sunlight dancing across the hillsides. When I returned, he had already arranged sandwiches, fresh fruit, and 2 bottles of water on the weathered wooden table. "Still cutting the apple into slices?" I said with a smile. He looked genuinely surprised. "You have never liked biting into whole apples?" I shook my head in disbelief. "You remember everything." He hesitated for just a moment before quietly replying, "Not everything. Just the things that matter to me." The words settled gently between us. They were simple, almost casual, yet they carried a weight I could no longer ignore. After lunch, Mason walked toward a nearby overlook while I stayed behind to organize my camera equipment. As I reached into the back of the SUV to put away a lens, I noticed the familiar storage box sitting beneath a folded blanket. This time the lid had shifted farther open than before, revealing several old photographs scattered near the top. I did not intend to search through them, but one picture resting partly outside the stack immediately caught my attention. It showed 2 boys sitting on the hood of an old pickup truck during a county fair many years earlier. Mason and I could not have been older than 13. We were laughing so hard that neither of us had noticed the camera. Behind that photograph rested another from our high school graduation, then one from my college photography exhibition, followed by ticket stubs from baseball games, summer festivals, camping permits, and small souvenirs from birthdays I had nearly forgotten. Every memory somehow included both of us. Before I could look any farther, I noticed the edge of the sealed envelope again. My name remained carefully written across the front, but this time I also saw a faded date beneath it. It had been written almost 5 years earlier. My heart quietly skipped a beat. 5 years. Whatever words waited inside that envelope had been carried through countless seasons without ever reaching me. I gently lowered the lid exactly as I had found it, just as Mason returned carrying our empty cooler. He smiled with complete trust, never questioning what I had been doing. During the next several miles, I stared out the passenger window watching endless highways stretch toward the horizon, but my thoughts never left the storage box behind us. For the first time since this journey began, I found myself wondering whether the road ahead was not leading me toward a beautiful destination at all, but toward an answer that had been waiting patiently beside me for years. The afternoon sun slowly drifted west as the highway climbed into higher elevations, carrying us deeper into a landscape of towering pines and distant mountain ridges. The farther we drove from the nearest town, the quieter everything became. Cell service disappeared without either of us noticing at first, replaced by the comforting rhythm of tires rolling across smooth pavement and the occasional song drifting through the speakers. I rested my elbow against the open window, letting the cool mountain air fill the car while Mason focused calmly on the winding road ahead. Every now and then he pointed toward an overlook or an unusual rock formation, knowing I would immediately reach for my camera. He had always anticipated what would capture my attention before I said a single word. It was another one of those quiet habits I had never questioned until this trip. Late in the afternoon, just as we rounded a narrow curve overlooking a broad valley, the SUV gave a brief shudder. Mason frowned slightly before easing off the accelerator. A soft warning light appeared on the dashboard. "That is new," he murmured. He carefully guided the vehicle onto a gravel turnout overlooking miles of untouched forest. The engine continued running, but something clearly felt different. Mason stepped outside, opened the hood, and studied the engine with the calm expression of someone who had solved mechanical problems his entire career. I joined him a moment later. "Is it serious?" I asked. He smiled reassuringly. "Nothing dangerous. I think one sensor is acting up, but I would rather let the engine cool before checking everything properly." We settled onto a nearby wooden bench overlooking the valley while the afternoon breeze moved gently through the trees. There were no passing cars for several minutes at a time. The silence felt almost unreal compared to the constant noise of everyday life. I lifted my camera instinctively, capturing the endless layers of mountains fading into soft blue distance. Mason watched me instead of the scenery. "You always look happiest when you are behind that camera," he said quietly. I lowered it and smiled. Maybe because photographs make me slow down long enough to notice what is already there. He nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds familiar." I looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" He rested his hands together before answering. "Sometimes people spend so much time searching for something extraordinary that they overlook what has been standing beside them for years." His words were gentle, almost casual, yet they settled somewhere much deeper than ordinary conversation. Before I could respond, he changed the subject by asking about a photography exhibit I had recently completed. I answered, but part of my attention remained on what he had just said. After nearly 40 minutes, the engine had cooled enough for Mason to inspect it more carefully. He tightened a loose electrical connection, restarted the vehicle, and smiled when the warning light disappeared. "Looks like we are back on the road." As we continued driving, the setting sun painted long shadows across the mountains. The peaceful silence between us returned, but it no longer felt quite the same. I found myself remembering the photographs inside the storage box, the carefully preserved ticket stubs, the friendship bracelet, and especially the unopened letter with my name written across the front 5 years earlier. One question quietly echoed through my thoughts. How many moments had Mason remembered that I had simply lived without realizing how much they meant to him? For the first time since our journey began, I stopped wondering what the letter might say. Instead, I began wondering how someone could carry unspoken words for so many years without allowing even a single one of them to fade. The mountains gradually gave way to towering sea cliffs as the final stretch of our journey unfolded beneath a sky painted with soft shades of amber and pale blue. According to the old paper map folded inside the glove compartment, we were only a few miles from the overlook we had circled with red marker when we were 12 years old. I smiled to myself, remembering how confidently we had declared that one day we would stand there together without having the slightest idea how long growing up could take. "We are almost there," Mason said quietly, his voice carrying the same mixture of excitement and nervousness I had begun noticing more often since the trip began. The road curved gently along the coastline before opening onto a small parking area overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The view stole my breath immediately. Endless waves rolled toward the cliffs below, while the setting sun transformed the water into shimmering gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of salt through the air as seabirds drifted effortlessly above the shoreline. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Some places seemed too beautiful for conversation. I reached for my camera almost automatically, capturing the horizon, the cliffs, and finally Mason standing near the railing with the ocean stretching endlessly behind him. He turned toward me just as I lowered the camera. "Did you get a good picture?" he asked with a gentle smile. "I think it might be my favorite one from the whole trip." I answered honestly. He laughed softly. You always say that until you take the next one. We wandered slowly along the overlook, reading the weathered information signs and watching the waves crash far below. It felt strangely familiar despite neither of us having visited before. Perhaps it was because we had imagined this place so many times as children that finally standing here felt less like discovering somewhere new and more like returning to a promise that had patiently waited for us. As the sun drifted lower, Mason rested both hands on the wooden railing and stared toward the horizon. Do you remember what you told me when we drew this route on the map? He asked. I searched my memory before shaking my head. Not exactly. He smiled without looking away from the ocean. You said that if we ever made it here, it would mean we had stayed in each other's lives no matter what happened. I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest. That sounds like something 12-year-old me would believe. Mason nodded slowly. I believed it too. The breeze lifted his hair slightly as silence settled between us again. This time it did not feel empty. It felt full of every shared birthday, every late-night phone call, every memory preserved inside the storage box waiting in the back of the SUV. Finally, Mason reached into the pocket of his jacket and gently held something in his hand without showing it to me. I recognized the faded edge immediately. It was the sealed envelope with my name written across the front. He looked down at it for a long moment before taking a slow breath. I have carried this with me for 5 years, he said quietly. I thought this overlook would be the right place to give it to you, but now I am not sure whether I should. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. Why have you kept it for so long? He smiled with equal parts hope and uncertainty. Because some words only make sense when the person hearing them has already seen everything that came before. As the last light of day settled across the ocean, I realized our journey had never truly been about reaching this beautiful coastline. It had always been leading us toward the moment when Mason would finally decide whether the letter belonged safely inside his pocket or in my hands. The evening breeze carried the scent of salt across the overlook as the last rays of sunlight slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The ocean below had turned into a deep shade of blue, and the first stars quietly appeared above us. Mason continued holding the sealed envelope without offering it to me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It felt as though every mile we had driven together had been leading toward this silence. Finally, he let out a slow breath and smiled, though there was unmistakable nervousness behind it. I do not think you should read this, he said softly. I looked at him with surprise. You carried it for 5 years. He nodded. I know, but the person who wrote it was afraid of losing his best friend. I am not that person anymore. He carefully opened the envelope himself, unfolded the slightly worn pages, and looked down at the familiar handwriting. There is only one part one want you to hear. His voice remained calm, but I could see his hands tremble ever so slightly before he began reading. If I ever find the courage to tell you how I feel, I hope it happens after we have shared enough memories that you already know who I am without these words. If that day never comes, I hope I still get to spend my life cheering for your happiness, even if I have to do it quietly. He lowered the letter before reaching the final paragraph. I never finished the last page, he admitted with a small smile. I realized no letter could say what I wanted better than simply telling you myself. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it back inside the envelope before looking directly into my eyes. Ethan, I have loved you for longer than I ever planned to admit. It did not happen all at once. It happened through every birthday, every late-night phone call, every terrible joke you laughed at anyway, every photograph you asked me to stand in even though I never liked having my picture taken. Somewhere along the way you stopped being only my best friend. You became the person I wanted beside me whenever life gave me something worth celebrating or something difficult to survive. I never expected you to feel the same. That is why I kept the letter instead of giving it to you. I thought protecting our friendship mattered more than risking it. The waves continued rolling gently against the cliffs below while I searched for the right words. Instead of speaking immediately, I found myself remembering the entire journey behind us. The old paper map he had preserved for 14 years. The way he always remembered my favorite breakfast. The photographs inside the storage box. The carefully saved ticket stubs, the friendship bracelet, the county fair picture, the road slowing whenever I reached for my camera, the apple. Already sliced because he knew I preferred it that way. None of those moments had been grand declarations. Together they had quietly become one. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. I think the reason I never noticed the answer before this trip, I said gently, is because I was too busy looking for one big moment. I never realized you had been telling me the truth through 1,000 small ones. Mason looked at me without speaking, hope and uncertainty meeting in the same expression. I stepped a little closer and rested one hand gently on his shoulder. I do not need to read the rest of the letter, I said quietly. The road brought me here before the words ever could. For the first time since we had left home, the distance between us no longer felt measured in miles, but in years of unspoken feelings that had finally found their way into the open beneath the endless evening sky. For several quiet moments, neither of us moved. The waves continued their steady rhythm against the cliffs below, and the evening breeze carried away the last traces of the day's warmth. Mason searched my face as though he was still preparing himself for disappointment, even after everything I had just said. I understood why. 5 years of silence could not disappear in a single conversation, no matter how honest it had become. I smiled first, hoping to ease the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. You know what surprises me the most? I asked softly. He shook his head. I always believed the biggest memories from our friendship were the camping trips, the baseball games, or finally making this road trip happen. I never realized the real story was hidden inside all the ordinary days between them. Mason let out a quiet laugh. Those ordinary days were always my favorite. We remained beside the overlook until the last hint of sunlight disappeared beyond the Pacific. Eventually, we walked back toward the SUV without feeling the need to rush. The parking area had grown almost empty, leaving only the sound of distant waves and the gentle rustle of the wind. Mason opened the passenger door for me out of habit before catching himself and smiling awkwardly. I have been doing that a lot lately. You have? I replied with a grin. I simply never asked why. He started the engine, but neither of us reached for the map right away. Instead, we sat quietly watching the headlights illuminate the narrow coastal road ahead. So, Mason finally said, "Where do we go now?" I looked at the folded map resting between us. Every destination we had circled as children had already been crossed off in bright red ink. There was nowhere left to drive according to our original plan. I gently folded the map closed and placed it inside the glove compartment. Home, I answered, but not because the adventure is over. He looked at me curiously. I smiled, because I think we finally found what we were searching for. The drive back felt completely different from every mile behind us. We still admired the scenery, stopped for photographs, and shared terrible roadside coffee whenever we found another small diner. Yet something inside both of us had become lighter. Conversation flowed naturally from old memories to future dreams. Mason admitted he had once considered accepting an engineering position across the country, but declined because the thought of living far away from me never felt right. I confessed that every time I returned from a photography assignment, he had always been the first person I wanted to call, even when I convinced myself it was simply because we had known each other forever. The farther east we traveled, the more those quiet truths connected into something unmistakable. Late the following afternoon, we reached the familiar county road leading back toward our hometown. The fields looked exactly as they had when we rode our bicycles there as children, and the old water tower still stood above the trees like a landmark waiting patiently for us to return. Mason slowed the SUV as we passed the small park where we had first unfolded that paper map 14 years earlier. "Do you remember sitting over there?" he asked, pointing toward a weathered picnic table beneath a large oak tree. I nodded with a smile. 2 kids planning a journey they thought would only take one summer. Mason parked the vehicle beside the empty playground. We walked to the picnic table together, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I looked at him and quietly said, "We kept the promise. It just took us a little longer than we expected." His smile carried the same warmth I had known since we were 12 years old. But now I finally understood that behind it had always been a love patient enough to wait until both of us were ready to see the road for what it had truly been from the very beginning. The days following our return settled into a comfortable rhythm that somehow felt both wonderfully familiar and completely new. Life did not transform overnight into something dramatic. Mason still left for the engineering firm every weekday just after 7 in the morning. I still accepted photography assignments that took me across the state whenever clients called. From the outside, Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Only we understood how much had quietly changed. One Saturday morning, I found myself standing outside the neighborhood cafe where we had spent countless afternoons after Little League games years before. Mason arrived carrying 2 coffees, smiling the moment he saw me waiting by the entrance. "You ordered before I got here," I said. He handed me the cup without hesitation. "Hazelnut latte with oat milk," he replied. "You have not changed your order in 3 years." I laughed, shaking my head. "I really need to become less predictable." He smiled warmly. "Please do not." We spent the morning wandering through the farmer's market, stopping at small booths selling handmade crafts, fresh flowers, and local artwork. Several neighbors recognized us immediately. Most greeted us exactly as they always had, asking about our road trip and laughing when Mason admitted we had driven farther than either of us originally planned. Watching him speak so naturally made me realize something important. He was not trying to become someone different after finally telling me the truth. He was simply allowing me to see the version of himself that had always existed beneath quiet patience and unwavering kindness. Later that afternoon, we visited my parents for dinner. My mother welcomed Mason with the same affectionate smile she had worn ever since we were children, immediately insisting that he was too thin and needed another serving of homemade lasagna. My father laughed and asked endless questions about the trip, while pretending not to notice how often Mason and I exchanged amused glances across the table. After dessert, my mother quietly joined me in the kitchen, while Mason helped my father carry dishes into the dining room. She dried one plate before smiling knowingly. "He looks happier," she said. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Both of you," she replied gently. "Sometimes the people closest to us see things long before we do." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, I looked out the passenger window as familiar streets passed beneath the warm glow of streetlights. "Can I ask you something?" I said softly. Mason nodded. "Anything." I turned toward him with a thoughtful smile. "Did anyone else know how you felt before I did?" He laughed quietly. "Your mother." I looked at him in complete surprise. "She knew?" He nodded. "She never said it directly. One afternoon a few years ago, she thanked me for always looking after you. Then she smiled and said, 'Whatever happens, do not stop believing in him.' I think she understood more than either of us." I smiled, feeling another small piece of our story fall perfectly into place. When we reached my apartment, neither of us hurried to say goodnight. We stood beside the SUV beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, talking about future road trips, photography projects, and places we still wanted to see together. For the first time, those conversations were no longer built on childhood promises or unanswered questions. They were built on honesty, shared dreams, and the comforting certainty that the road ahead belonged to both of us, one ordinary day at a time. Autumn arrived almost without either of us noticing. The trees surrounding our hometown slowly traded their deep summer green for shades of amber, crimson, and gold, and cool mornings became an excuse to linger a little longer over coffee before beginning another busy day. Looking back, I realized that the greatest surprise was not how quickly our relationship had changed after the road trip. It was how natural everything felt afterward. There was never a moment when we had to pretend to be different people. Mason was still the thoughtful engineer who quietly solved problems before anyone else noticed them. I was still the photographer who became distracted whenever beautiful light appeared across the horizon. The only difference was that we no longer hid how much we appreciated sharing those ordinary moments together. One Saturday morning, Mason called with an idea. "Do you remember the old hiking trail behind the county park?" he asked. I smiled immediately. "The one where we got completely lost when we were 15? He laughed. "Technically, you were the one holding the map." Less than an hour later, we found ourselves walking beneath colorful trees, following the same narrow path we had explored countless times as teenagers. The trail looked smaller now, yet every turn awakened another memory. We laughed about scraped knees, forgotten lunches, school projects, and the endless confidence only children seemed capable of having. Halfway up the trail, we reached the wooden overlook where we used to sit for hours talking about our futures. The old bench had been replaced, but the view remained exactly the same. Rolling hills stretched toward the horizon beneath a bright blue sky, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the air. I lifted my camera, instinctively framing the landscape before lowering it again. Mason noticed. "No picture?" he asked. I smiled. Not this time. He looked curious. Why not? I glanced toward him instead of the scenery. Because sometimes I spend so much time trying to preserve a moment that I forget to actually live it. His expression softened with quiet understanding. We sat together on the bench without speaking for several minutes, watching sunlight move slowly across the valley. Eventually, Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out the old paper map we had carried during the road trip. The folds had become even softer with age, and the faded red circles drawn by two 12-year-old boys were still visible. "I thought you might want this," he said, placing it gently into my hands. I looked at him in surprise. "You kept it all these years." He nodded. "But it belongs to both of us." I carefully unfolded the map once more. Every destination had now been crossed off, every dream completed, yet somehow the page no longer felt like the end of a journey. I smiled before taking a pen from my camera bag and drawing one small circle in an empty corner of the map. Mason watched with curiosity. "You found another place?" I shook my head. "Not a place." I handed him the pen. "A promise." He looked at the blank circle, then back at me. "What does it mean?" I smiled warmly. "It means we stop measuring our future by destinations. From now on, wherever life takes us next becomes the next adventure." Mason's quiet laugh carried the same warmth I had known since childhood. He folded the map carefully, slipped it back into his backpack, and together we started walking down the trail toward home, both of us understanding that the most meaningful journeys are never defined by the miles traveled, but by the person who chooses to walk beside you through every season that follows. Winter returned almost exactly 1 year after the journey that had quietly changed both of our lives. The first snowfall arrived overnight, covering the rooftops, sidewalks, and familiar streets of our hometown in the same peaceful silence that had once surrounded us on the road. Early Saturday morning, I woke to a text message from Mason that simply read, "Bring your camera. Meet me at the old park in 30 minutes. I smiled before I even finished reading it. Some invitations never needed further explanation. When I arrived, Mason was already standing beside the weathered picnic table where two 12-year-old boys had once unfolded a paper map and confidently planned an adventure they believed would happen the following summer. Snow rested across the tabletop, and tiny flakes continued drifting through the cold morning air. He held 2 steaming cups of coffee exactly the way he always did. "You are late," he teased. I accepted the cup with a laugh. "By 2 whole minutes." I noticed. We walked slowly through the quiet park, leaving the first footprints across the untouched snow. Families laughed in the distance while children built snowmen near the playground, but around us everything felt wonderfully calm. After a while, Mason stopped beside the old oak tree where we had spent countless afternoons talking about dreams that once seemed impossibly far away. "I have something for you," he said. From his coat pocket, he carefully removed the same sealed envelope that had traveled across the country with us. I looked at it in surprise. "I thought you decided I did not need to read it." He nodded. "You did not, but I think you should keep it." He placed it gently into my hands. "Not because of what is written inside, because it reminds me that fear almost convinced me to stay silent forever. I never want either of us to forget what happens when honesty finally wins." I carefully turned the envelope over, noticing how worn the paper had become after years of being carried from place to place. I still did not open it. Instead, I slipped it safely into my camera bag. "I think it belongs there," I said. Mason smiled with quiet understanding. "Still choosing memories over words?" "Sometimes memories say more." We continued walking until we reached the small hill overlooking the frozen pond. I raised my camera toward the winter landscape, then lowered it almost immediately. Mason noticed and laughed softly. "You are doing that more often lately." I looked toward him instead of the scenery. "Because I finally learned something important." "What is that?" I smiled. "The best moments are not always the ones I photograph. Sometimes they are the ones I simply live." He looked at me with the same warm expression that had followed us from childhood through every season of our lives. We stood together watching snowflakes drift across the frozen water, comfortable in the silence that had always been one of the strongest parts of our friendship and had now become one of the strongest parts of our future. Looking back, I realized the road trip had never changed who we were. It simply gave us enough time to recognize what had quietly been growing between us since we were children. Every map eventually reaches its final destination, every highway eventually ends, and every journey becomes a memory. Yet the greatest gift that trip ever gave us was not a place on the coast, a collection of photographs, or even a letter carried for 5 years. It was the courage to stop waiting for the perfect moment and discover that home had never been waiting at the end of the road. Home had been traveling beside us all along. Several years have passed since the morning we stood together in the snow, carrying nothing more than 2 cups of coffee and a future neither of us had dared to imagine when we were children. Sometimes people ask me which photograph has become the most meaningful in my career. They expect me to mention a breathtaking mountain range, a famous city skyline, or a perfect sunset captured after hours of waiting for the right light. I always smile before giving the same answer. My favorite photograph is one I have never shown anyone. It sits inside a small wooden frame on the bookshelf in my studio. It is a simple picture of Mason standing beside the Pacific Ocean at sunset, smiling because he thought I was taking another ordinary travel photograph. He never realized that, at that exact moment, I was capturing the instant before both of our lives quietly changed forever. The old paper map now hangs beside that photograph. Its faded red circles, worn folds, and tiny handwritten notes remind us that dreams do not always arrive according to the schedule we imagine as children. Sometimes they wait patiently until we have grown into the people capable of appreciating them. The sealed letter remains safely tucked inside my camera bag, even today. I have still never opened it. Friends occasionally laugh when they hear that story, asking how I can resist reading something that waited 5 years to be delivered. The truth is simple. I already know everything that matters. The letter belongs to the frightened version of Mason who believed honesty might cost him the person he loved most. The man standing beside me now no longer hides behind unwritten endings or unanswered questions. Every ordinary morning has become the ending that letter hoped for. Life continues moving forward in wonderfully ordinary ways. Mason still reminds me to pack an extra jacket whenever I leave before sunrise to photograph a landscape. I still stop the car too often whenever beautiful light appears across an open field. We continue discovering small towns with excellent coffee, quiet hiking trails, family-owned bookstores, and scenic roads that somehow never appeared on our original map. Occasionally, we even unfold that faded paper map across the kitchen table, smiling as we remember 2 boys who believed every important destination could be circled with a red marker. They were wrong about that. The greatest destinations cannot be found on paper. They are built slowly through trust, patience, shared laughter, quiet forgiveness, and countless ordinary days spent choosing each other again and again. Looking back now, I understand that our road trip never changed our hearts. It simply slowed the world enough for us to notice what had been quietly growing there all along. If there is one lesson I hope every traveler, every dreamer, and every lifelong friend carries away from our story, it is this. Do not wait for the perfect highway, the perfect season, or the perfect words before telling someone they matter. Maps eventually fade, roads eventually end, and years pass more quickly than anyone expects. Yet kindness remembered, promises kept, and love expressed with honesty have a remarkable way of outlasting every mile. Whenever I see another long stretch of open highway disappearing toward the horizon, I no longer wonder where it leads. I simply smile, because the most important journey of my life was never measured by the distance we traveled together. It was measured by the quiet certainty that the boy who promised to stay beside me when we were 12 kept that promise through every season, every mile, and every tomorrow that followed, proving that sometimes the road home is not a place you finally reach, but a person who has been walking beside you from the very beginning.